Hey everyone, so the purpose of this video here is we just want to go over some of the basic question types you're going to see on the AP exam, give you a few tips and tricks related to those. I'm also going to talk about where some of the resources are for the AP exam, and lastly, I'd like to go over a little bit just some important concepts and a resource that I've created that you've actually had in your notebooks for a while but maybe you weren't aware of, that might be pretty beneficial, especially considering this year it's a take-home exam. So let's start with the question types, and we're going to begin with the question type that we're probably the most familiar with, and that is the qualitative quantitative translation. So this is a question type that you've spent a lot of time doing this year. Okay, this is probably the question type that we did the most. And so these are the questions where, as the title says, you have both qualitative questions you're being asked as well as quantitative. And we'll talk about what that translation piece means in a second, because that does tend to link the two. Okay, so typically for these questions, you'll be given some situation and you'll ask qualitative questions like, if this happens, will this increase, decrease, or remain the same? And then you'll also have some derivations. These are also the question types where sometimes you're asked if an equation is plausible. You've gotten that recently on some of those practice exams where you have to explain whether or not, even if the equation is incorrect, whether or not it could be plausible. These are also the ones where you'll have the student 1 says this and student 2 says this, and which parts are correct or incorrect kind of questions. So that's the question type you're looking at here. Some tips with these ones. Don't be afraid to answer them out of order. I know I've said that a lot throughout the year, but there's nothing wrong with doing part C before you do part B. I would advise you kind of quickly glance through the questions all together at once, just so you know basically what you're going to be asked to do in the question as a whole, and keep that in the back of your mind in case you do want to do them slightly out of order. There's nothing wrong with a question that, even if it says explain it purely using concepts, if you do a derivation, figure out what the answer should be based off of the derivation and then go back and try to explain it conceptually. I know I say this a lot, but I always find it easier to come up with a conceptual explanation if I'm confident that my answer is correct, rather than trying to think about the answer and think about the explanation at the same time. I also want to talk about the meaning of some of the words that you'll see in these types of problems. So the first set is explain or describe. That means you want to use words to justify your answer. Okay, so when you see explain or describe, don't derive. Certainly you can make reference to an equation. For example, if you wanted to say, that in Newton's second law, it tells us that force and acceleration are directly proportional. That's great and that's perfectly okay. But your main source of justifying your answer should be words. Derive or calculate means the exact opposite. That's where we are going to use our mathematical reasoning to come up with an answer. So there you should be using derivations, you should be using math, etc. Justify is kind of like a hodgepodge of them both. That means you could use equations, you could use words, you could use a combination of the two. All right, so there's lots of different options. All right. Do keep in mind that unless it explicitly says you can't use one of these, you certainly can use an equation to supplement and explain or derive, or a concept to supplement or derive or calculate, but the bulk of your answer should be either words or math. Okay. Sketch, you'll see this word sometimes when asked to draw a graph, and that means it should just be a very quick drawing. You don't have to worry about hitting exact points, you don't have to worry about labeling axes, which is different than the word plot, which means we do actually want to consider what is the maximum value, what is the minimum value. We do want to label our axes, typically with problems or with things we found in other parts of the problem. One thing to keep in mind is a general statement that you can always come back to is, if you don't know the answer to one part, but you know you need that part for a latter part, so maybe you didn't get B correct, you don't know how to do B, but you know if you had B, you'd be able to do part C, just make something up. Say that the answer to B is X and go from there. And AP should give you at least partial credit, if not all the credit, for part C based off of your answer to B. The one last thing I want to talk about is a lot of these questions, and like I said, there will be one of these on the exam, it will be the first one, will ask you to, once you do your qualitative part and your quantitative part, they'll ask you to connect them. So these are the questions where sometimes we'll say, explain how your derivation or which parts of your derivation from part C support your answer to part B, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so be prepared for that. Make sure that you draw upon specific things. Typically, they're not looking for you to just say, well, the final answer of my derivation was this. They want you to look at steps within that derivation that ultimately lead to the answer. So that's something to keep in mind for these types of problems. The next problem type is the experimental design, and love them or hate them. They don't matter right now because they are not on this year's AP exam. Let's start explaining what the second type of question that you'll see is. This will be the second question on your exam, and it will be the 15-minute question with 5 minutes to respond, and that is the paragraph length response question. Now, you've seen an example of each of these on the past two practice exams, but let's talk a little bit about them. They'll always set up with some basic question that is usually worth a point or two, and a lot of times they'll be drawing a graph, drawing a free body diagram, answering just a quick question, and the idea of this is to kind of get you thinking about the right concept or traveling down that right road towards the longer explanation, which is always the second part of the question. Now, in that longer explanation, we'll always have this phrasing: in a clear, coherent paragraph length response, please blah, 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 answer this question, okay? So what I would suggest is use those intro quick questions to your advantage. They are there for a reason. They are there to help guide your thinking. Use them as a hint. Perfect example of this was on the first practice exam. You had the puck colliding with the rod, and the first question asked you about the angular momentum of the puck and the angular momentum of the rod. And what you ended up seeing was that idea of angular momentum and the conservation of angular momentum was key to answering the question. So that was there for a reason. Use it to your advantage, okay? The next tip I would give you is make sure that you have a logical flow to your paragraph. So I would kind of like, I don't think there's anything wrong with sketching out what your major ideas are, or at least jotting down a few important points, and think about how you can organize them in a logical manner. Okay, if you have all of the ideas there, but they're just a jumbled mess, then it's not clear how they're related or not clear how you link one idea to the next, you're not going to get full credit for this. There's always one point for basically how well you wrote this, how well you argued it, was it logical? So you need to make sure that you are thinking at least a little bit about the writing aspect of this in addition to the physics aspect. In terms of length, I would say that 4 to 5 sentences is a pretty good rule of thumb, all right? Writing 1 or 2 sentences will most definitely not give you full credit, but also writing too much is bad. You're going to lose that clear, coherent paragraph length response piece, okay, because you're going to ultimately end up adding information that's really just not necessary. So 4 to 5 sentences is a pretty good rule of thumb. It's not a hard rule, but it gives you at least some idea of about how long this paragraph should be, all right? I think there is kind of a strategy to this. Sometimes you'll have a ranking and then you'll be explaining that ranking. Sometimes you'll just have to flat out answer the question, but always start with that. And then to really jump into your explanation piece, I think you either should start with a very obvious observation about the situation, or start with a basic principle of physics. And from there, your goal is to kind of link that observation or basic principle to something else, and link that something else to something else, and eventually tie it all back around to what your ultimate answer is. Okay, so there is definitely a strategy here, and you kind of want to think about, okay, so the question's asking about time. I'm going to start with Newton's laws. How do I get from Newton's laws to time? Well, Newton's laws tells me about acceleration. Acceleration tells me about velocity, and so on. So you do kind of want to think about that flow there from your basic idea, principle, observation, to tying it back around to ultimately answering the question that you're being asked. Certainly don't be afraid to use diagrams, graphs. You can cite basic equations. This isn't meant to be a derivation, but certainly looking at the relationships that exist in equations can be used as evidence for your answer. So don't feel like you have to use only words. If it's easier to explain with an equation, go for it. But just be aware that it is a paragraph length response, not a derivation. The last thing I want to talk about is a document that actually has been in your packets for most of the year, but maybe you weren't aware of it or didn't really notice it or forgot about it. But I think it's quite useful given that for this AP exam, you're going to be able to take it as an open note exam. And so this document, which is also posted on Schoology, kind of breaks down all the different units we did throughout the year. It's a few different pages. This is just the first page. And within each unit, it gives you some really, really key, important, fundamental concepts. These are like the big take home, if you only remember these three ideas, kind of ideas. I'm not going to go through and read all of them for you, but these are really some key fundamental ideas that you still should have memorized, even though it's open note, but certainly because it is open note, you can use this as a reference. But spend some time working through this document. You should read through all these things, and as you're reading through, you should say, oh yeah, I know that. Or possibly an even better idea is you try and make your own document similar to this and compare. See if there's things that maybe you put on there that I didn't, or vice versa, things that I put on that you didn't put on. But think about what your really, really key important ideas are. Your ideas that you can draw upon for explanations, your ideas that would be good kind of starting points for any problem. And then I also have the equations that are relevant to that section listed. Certainly you're familiar with your equation sheet, and I would encourage you to use that, but this does also have the equations for you. And so here you see just a few more units here: circular motion through rotational motion, rotational kinetics. We will eventually get to a point, here's more rotational stuff. We will eventually get to a point where there's topics we don't need to know. Electrostatics is one, circuits, and waves. This sheet was made at a time when we did have all of those units, but they are not needed for this exam. The only one near the end that we need is this simple harmonic motion piece. All right, one last thing I just want to point out here. You do have on the Schoology page a lot of this information that I was referring to. If you go on the Schoology page and you go down to the unit that says AP Exam Review, you'll find a number of these resources here. Obviously all the 2020 exam information is there, but there's the topics to memorize and the 3 types of questions. So feel free to download, print, whatever, them on your own. But this is really your best spot for any information about the exam. Great place to reference over the next few days as you do your final preparations for the AP exam.